The most expensive signature in history was not written by a president on a peace treaty or a king on a royal decree. It was scrawled by me, a paralyzed wife, lying in a hospital bed, handing over my dignity, or so my husband thought. He looked at my broken body and saw a liability to be discarded like a leased car with too much mileage. I looked at the divorce papers he threw at me and saw an opportunity. He thought he was cutting off a dead limb to save his lifestyle. He had no idea that my signature was actually the activation code for his absolute financial destruction. My name is Jasmine Vance, and at 34 years old, I specialize in calculating risk. As a senior risk analyst for one of Chicago's biggest firms, I spot the tiny cracks in a foundation that can bring a whole skyscraper down. My husband Marcus, however, never bothered to learn what I actually did for a living. To him, I was just a decorative ornament that looked good in our penthouse and knew which wine to pair with sea bass. He thought he was the shark in our marriage. He had no idea he was swimming in my tank. Before I tell you how a tragic accident revealed the monster I married, and how I destroyed him with a single pen stroke, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to rebuild yourself after someone else tried to break you. It all happened on a Tuesday night in November. The kind of rainy Chicago night where the streetlights smear against the wet asphalt like spilled oil. We were scheduled to attend the mayor's charity gala. It was a mandatory event for Marcus's image as the city's rising real estate star. He had left 20 minutes early in a private car claiming he needed to network before the crowd got too thick. He left me to drive our Mercedes alone. I was running late, my mind distracted by the slippery roads and the tightness of my evening gown. I remember checking the rearview mirror for a split second. That was all it took. A massive delivery truck hydroplaned across the center line. I didn't even have time to scream. The impact sounded like a bomb going off inside a tin can. Metal screamed against metal. The world flipped violently once, then twice. I remember the sensation of weightlessness, followed by the crushing force of gravity as the car landed upside down in a drainage ditch. Then came the silence. It was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hissing of the radiator and the rhythmic ticking of the hazard lights. I tried to move my arms, but they wouldn't obey. I tried to move my legs and felt absolutely nothing. Just a cold, terrifying void where my lower body used to be. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. I hung there in the seatbelt, blood dripping from my hairline into my eyes, waiting for help. When the paramedics finally cut me out, the pain was blinding. I remember grabbing the sleeve of the first responder, a young man with kind eyes. "Please call my husband," I rasped out, giving him the number. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to know I wasn't alone. I drifted in and out of consciousness, but I was awake enough to hear the call. I watched the paramedic's face turn from urgent to disgusted. He hung up the phone and looked at his partner, shaking his head. I asked, "Is he coming?" The paramedic hesitated, looking down at me with profound pity, before whispering, "He asked if the car was totaled, ma'am. He didn't ask about you." That was the moment the darkness finally took me, not from the injury, but from the realization that I was already alone. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the first thing that pulled me back from the void. Beep, beep, beep. It was a relentless mechanical sound that seemed to drill directly into my skull. My eyelids felt like they were weighted down with lead, but I forced them open. The harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit burned my retinas. I tried to turn my head away from the glare, but I could not move. A rigid plastic brace was locked around my neck, holding me in a terrifying stillness. Panic began to rise in my chest again like rising floodwater, but my body felt heavy and disconnected, as if I were floating a few inches above the mattress. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee filled the air. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my brain. I wanted to see a doctor. I wanted to see my mother. But most of all, a foolish part of me still wanted to see Marcus holding my hand with tears in his eyes, telling me everything was going to be all right. I shifted my gaze to the foot of the bed, and there he was. But he was not holding my hand. He was not crying. Marcus stood there in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking as if he had just stepped out of a boardroom meeting rather than visiting his critically injured wife. He glanced at his Rolex with a look of impatience that chilled me more than the hospital air conditioning. Next to him stood a man I did not recognize. He was older, with a face like a bulldog and a briefcase that looked heavy. He was definitely not a doctor. Marcus looked up and saw my eyes were open. There was no relief in his expression, no softening of his jaw. He did not rush to my side. He did not ask if I was in pain. He did not ask if I could feel my legs. Instead, he took a step closer and spoke with a voice devoid of any warmth. "You are awake," he stated flatly. "The lawyer needs to know if you are lucid. Do you understand where you are and what is happening?" I tried to speak, but my mouth was so dry it felt like it was filled with cotton. I managed to make a raspy sound that might have been a yes. Marcus nodded at the stranger. "She is conscious and responsive. Get the papers ready." The lawyer placed his briefcase on the rolling table that usually held lunch trays. The click of the latches opening sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. I watched in confusion as he pulled out a thick stack of documents. My mind was racing, trying to piece together why my husband brought a legal team to the ICU before the doctors had even given me a prognosis. Marcus finally looked me in the eye, but it felt like he was looking through me. "Look, Jasmine," he said, smoothing his tie. "The doctors say your recovery is going to be long, very long, and frankly, I have a business to run. I cannot have my image tarnished by a spouse who requires 24-hour care. It projects weakness. And you know how I feel about weakness." He signaled the lawyer to hand me a pen. "I need you to sign these. It is better for both of us if we end this cleanly right now, before things get messy." The lawyer adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began to read from the document in a monotone drone that made the cruelty sound purely bureaucratic. He stated that his client, Mr. Vance, was seeking an immediate dissolution of marriage based on irreconcilable differences and incompatible lifestyles. I stared up at the ceiling tiles, trying to process the words. Incompatible lifestyles. That was the legal term for a husband who did not want a wife he had to carry to the bathroom. Marcus interrupted the lawyer, impatient with the formalities. "Let me make this simple for you, Jasmine," he said, leaning over the bedrail, his cologne suffocating me. "You totaled my custom Mercedes. That car was worth $150,000. The insurance company is already giving me a hard time because you were the driver." He paused to let the weight of the debt sink in. I watched his face, searching for a shred of the man I had married, but all I saw was a predator sensing weakness. He continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I could sue you for reckless driving, Jasmine. I could drag you through court for years and take every penny you have saved in your little 401k to pay for that car. Or you can sign this settlement agreement right now. You give me full ownership of the penthouse and I will agree not to sue you for the accident. It is a generous offer, considering you ruined my car and my evening." I looked at the document he was thrusting in my face. It was blackmail, pure and simple. He was leveraging my vulnerability to steal the home I had paid the down payment on. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the paper to shreds. But then my training took over. I am a risk analyst. I look for the details that others miss. I forced my eyes to focus on the dense legal text. I scanned past the paragraphs about the house and the furniture until my eyes landed on a small clause at the bottom of page 3, clause 14C. It was standard legal boilerplate, or at least that is what Marcus and his bulldog lawyer thought. The clause stated that in exchange for the marital residence, the husband explicitly waived all claims to the wife's personal speculative investments, intellectual property, and business ventures, deeming them of negligible value. My breath hitched in my throat. Negligible value? Marcus thought my side projects were just hobbies. He thought the startup shares I had bought years ago were worthless. He was so focused on grabbing the penthouse that he was unknowingly signing away his right to a fortune that was about to mature. I looked up at him. He was tapping his foot impatiently. "Well, Jasmine," he snapped, "do you want to be homeless and in debt or just homeless?" I reached for the pen with a trembling hand feigning defeat. I let a single tear roll down my cheek to sell the performance. "You are right, Marcus," I whispered. "I cannot fight you." I pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed smoothly as I signed my name. With every loop of the letters, I wasn't just signing away a house. I was signing his financial death warrant. I handed the clipboard back to the lawyer. Marcus snatched the paper, looking at my signature with a triumphant smirk. "Smart girl," he said, checking the signature to make sure it was legible. "You finally did something right." He had no idea that he had just traded a diamond mine for a pile of bricks. The ink was barely dry on the page before Marcus snatched the clipboard from my hands. He moved with the speed of a man securing a winning lottery ticket. He flipped through the pages one last time, ensuring every signature was in place and every initial was scrawled correctly. Satisfied, he snapped the folder shut and handed it to his lawyer. The sound of the latch clicking was final. It sounded like a prison door slamming shut, but I knew he was the one who had just locked himself in. He just did not know it yet. He straightened his tie and looked down at me. There was no trace of the husband who had vowed to love me in sickness and in health. There was only a businessman concluding a transaction. "Well, that is settled," he said, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his lapel. "By the way, you do not need to worry about packing. I took the liberty of hiring a moving crew this morning while you were in surgery. They have already cleared your personal effects from the penthouse. Everything is being sent to a storage unit in the south side. I texted you the access code." My breath caught in my throat. While doctors were drilling into my spine to save my life, he was directing movers to box up my clothes. He had erased me from our home before I had even woken up. He saw the shock on my face and offered a shrug that was almost apologetic, but entirely fake. "It was better this way, Jasmine," he said. "I did not want you to have the stress of moving while you are recovering. Plus, I have an interior decorator coming tomorrow. I want a fresh start, a fresh look." He turned to leave without a goodbye. He did not touch me. He did not wish me a fast recovery. He simply walked out the door, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the linoleum floor. The lawyer followed him like a well-trained dog. I watched them disappear down the hallway, and the silence crashed back into the room. It was heavier than before. A moment later, the nurse who had been checking the monitors in the corner stepped forward. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes that were currently filled with a thick, suffocating pity. I hated that look. It made me feel small. It made me feel like a victim. She reached for a box of tissues and held one out to me. Her voice was soft and trembling. "I am so sorry, honey," she whispered. "That was the coldest thing I have ever seen. Do you want to cry? It is okay to let it out." I looked at the tissue in her hand. It was white and flimsy, just like the marriage I had just ended. I looked up at her and shook my head slowly. My eyes were dry. My heart was pounding, not with sorrow, but with a cold, calculating rhythm. "No, thank you," I said, my voice steady and hard as steel. "I do not need to cry. Tears are for people who have lost something valuable. I haven't lost anything today. I just took out the trash." The nurse lowered her hand, surprised by my tone. She did not see a broken woman in the bed anymore. She saw something else, something dangerous. I lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling. The pain in my legs was still there, but it was distant now. It was overshadowed by a new sensation, a burning focus. Marcus thought he had stripped me of my home and my dignity. He thought he had left me powerless. But he forgot the first rule of risk analysis. Never underestimate a variable you cannot control, and he had just turned me into the most volatile variable in his life. I closed my eyes and began to count. Not sheep, but assets. I was mentally listing every single account, every single password, and every single weakness he had. The game had just begun. 2 weeks is an eternity when you are staring at a water stain on a hospital ceiling, counting the minutes until you are kicked out. When discharge day finally arrived, the silence in my room was deafening. There were no balloons. There was no husband pacing the hallway anxious to take me home. There was just me and a plastic bag containing my ruined evening gown and a pair of blood-stained heels. The discharge nurse asked me 3 times if I had a ride. Each time I lied and said my husband was parking the car. I waited until her shift ended before I wheeled myself out to the curb. The automatic doors slid open and the humid Chicago air hit me like a wet towel. I pulled out my phone to order a car. My thumb hovered over the premium black car service I had used for years. It was a habit born of a life I no longer had. I tapped the request button. A second later, a notification popped up in bright red letters. Card declined. Please contact your financial institution. I stared at the screen. Marcus had not just cut me off. He had scorched the earth. He had frozen the joint accounts and canceled my supplementary cards before I had even left the hospital property. I checked my wallet. I had $40 in cash and a debit card connected to an old checking account I hadn't used since college. I scrolled down to the cheapest ride option available, the one usually reserved for college students and desperate tourists. 10 minutes later, a rusted gray sedan screeched to a halt in front of me. The bumper was held on by duct tape, and the engine made a sound like a dying lawnmower. The driver, a man with grease stains on his shirt, rolled down the window and looked at my wheelchair with open hostility. "I ain't lifting that," he spat out. "My back is bad. You gotta get it in yourself or I am canceling the ride." The sky chose that exact moment to open up. It did not just rain. It poured. Cold, stinging droplets soaked my thin blouse instantly. I looked at the driver hoping for a shred of human decency, but he just turned up the radio. I gritted my teeth and unlocked the brakes on my chair. I had to drag my body out of the seat and onto the wet pavement of the curb. My legs, which used to run marathons, were now dead weight that I had to manually haul into the back seat. I clawed at the door handle, my fingernails breaking against the plastic. I hoisted myself up, using nothing but my arm strength, gasping for air, as pain shot through my healing spine. Passers-by looked away, pretending not to see the well-dressed woman crawling into a beat-up taxi. I finally collapsed onto the torn upholstery of the back seat, soaked and shaking. The driver didn't even turn around. He just popped the trunk for me to wait for a hospital orderly to throw the wheelchair in. As we pulled away into traffic, I watched the city blur through the rain-streaked window. We passed the restaurant where Marcus and I had our first date. We passed the boutique where I bought my wedding dress. Every block was a memory of a life that had been stolen from me. But as I shivered in that cold car, I stopped feeling the cold. The humiliation was burning it away. Marcus wanted me to feel like trash. He wanted me to feel helpless. But he forgot that trash is what you throw away. And I was not trash. I was recyclable. And I was about to come back in a form he would never recognize. The taxi taillights faded into the gray mist, leaving me alone on the sidewalk in front of the building. The limestone structure loomed above me, a monolith of wealth and security that I had purchased with my own commission checks 3 years ago. I sat in the wheelchair, shivering as the wind whipped off Lake Michigan, cutting through my thin blouse like a razor. I wheeled myself up the side ramp, a feature I had installed for my aging mother, never dreaming I would be the one using it. My hands were raw and blistered from gripping the wet rubber rims, but I forced myself forward. I reached the heavy oak double doors and fumbled for my keychain. It was a Tiffany charm Marcus had given me for our anniversary, a hollow gesture of silver that now felt heavy and mocking in my hand. I slid the gold key into the lock, expecting the familiar click that signaled safety. Instead, the metal stopped halfway. I pushed harder, thinking it was just stiff from the cold. It would not budge. I pulled it out and tried again, jamming it in with desperate force until my knuckles turned white. Nothing. I leaned forward and looked closely at the hardware. The brass was shiny and unscratched. It was brand new. He had changed the locks. A wave of nausea rolled over me. He had not just evicted me, he had sealed the fortress. I pressed the video intercom button, my finger leaving a smudge of blood on the polished steel. I waited. The camera light blinked red, watching me like a mechanical eye. Finally, the speaker crackled to life. "Who is it?" a voice asked hesitantly. It was Maria, our housekeeper. A woman I had hired 5 years ago. A woman whose daughter's college tuition I had helped pay. "Maria, it is me, Jasmine," I said, my voice trembling with cold and rage. "Open the door, Maria. I need to get inside." There was a long, agonizing silence. Then the heavy door cracked open, just an inch kept firmly in place by the security chain. I saw Maria's face in the gap. She looked terrified, her eyes darting back towards the elevator bank, as if she expected a monster to appear. "Mrs. Jasmine," she whispered, "you cannot be here. Mr. Marcus said you do not live here anymore. He gave strict orders. He said if I let you in, he will fire me immediately and call the police for trespassing." "Maria, I bought this house," I pleaded, gripping the cold doorframe. "I have nowhere to go. It is freezing and I am in a wheelchair. Please just let me into the lobby to dry off." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I am sorry, Mrs. Jasmine. He is watching the security cameras right now. I have 3 kids to feed. I cannot lose this job. Please go away before he sees you." The door slammed shut. The deadbolt slid home with a heavy thud that vibrated through the frame and into my bones. I sat there staring at the wood grain, my reflection distorted in the varnish. The rain intensified, drumming against my skull. I was locked out of my own life. I looked up at the penthouse windows on the 40th floor. I could see the warm, golden glow of the chandelier. I imagined him up there sipping my vintage scotch, probably laughing at the thought of me wet and broken on the sidewalk. He thought he had won. He thought the rain would wash me away. He did not realize it was watering the seeds of my vengeance. I wiped the water from my eyes and turned my wheelchair around to face the street. I did not have a home anymore, but I had a plan. And unlike this house, my plan was bulletproof. The sound of the heavy deadbolt sliding back made my heart jump. For a split second, a foolish hope sparked in my chest. I thought maybe Marcus had come to his senses, or perhaps Maria had found the courage to defy him. The door swung open slowly, revealing the warm golden light of the foyer. But it was not Marcus standing there, and it was certainly not Maria. It was Mama Louise. My mother-in-law stood on the threshold, like a gatekeeper to hell, dressed in a cream-colored cashmere cardigan that I knew cost $600 because I was the one who bought it for her last Christmas. She looked down at me with a sneer that twisted her perfectly made-up face. It was pouring rain now, a freezing Chicago downpour that soaked through my clothes and chilled me to the bone. Mama Louise popped open a large black umbrella. I expected her to step forward to shield me from the storm, even for a moment. Instead, she tilted the umbrella carefully so it only covered her fresh blowout, leaving me exposed to the elements. She took a step onto the porch, her heels clicking on the stone. "Look at you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You look like a drowned rat. I told Marcus he should have sent you to a state facility directly from the hospital. Bringing you here would only lower the property value." I gripped the wet rims of my wheelchair, my knuckles turning white. "Mama Louise," I said, my voice shaking from the cold. "I paid for this house. I paid for your heart surgery last year. How can you stand there and watch me freeze?" She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Jasmine. You paid for a few things. So what? That is what a dutiful daughter-in-law is supposed to do. But you are not useful anymore, are you? You are broken goods. My son is a rising star in this city. He needs a wife who can walk beside him at galas, not a cripple he has to push around like a shopping cart." She leaned in closer, the umbrella rim dripping water onto my lap. "And let us be honest, dear. You were failing him long before the accident. 5 years of marriage and not a single grandchild. You could not give him a son when your legs worked, so what use are you to him now? Marcus needs a woman who is whole. a woman who can give him a legacy, not a barren burden in a wheelchair. The words hit me harder than the car crash. She knew exactly where to strike. She knew how much we had struggled with fertility, how many tears I had shed in private. And now she was using my pain as a weapon to justify throwing me out on the street. She checked her nails, looking bored with my suffering. "Do yourself a favor and roll away before the neighbors call the police," she said, turning back toward the warmth of the house. "You do not belong here anymore, Jasmine. You are just a stain on the driveway now." She stepped back inside and closed the door without looking back. The lock clicked shut again, leaving me alone in the rain, with the echo of her cruelty ringing in my ears. I stared at the closed door, wiping the rain from my face. She called me a burden. She called me useless. But as I sat there shivering, I realized she had made a fatal mistake. She thought I was weak because I couldn't walk. She forgot that my brain was the most dangerous muscle I had. And she had just given me all the motivation I needed to ensure that when I brought this family down, she would be the first one to fall. The door opened again, but this time it was not Mama Louise. It was Marcus. He was struggling with two large, heavy-duty black trash bags. He stepped out onto the porch, not caring that his Italian loafers were getting wet. He looked down at me with a mixture of disgust and theatrical exhaustion. He heaved the bags over the railing. They hit the wet pavement of the driveway with a sickening wet thud. One of the bags split open, spilling its contents onto the muddy ground. I stared in horror as my clothes, my favorite silk blouses, the cashmere sweaters I had bought with my first bonus check, and the dress I wore on our honeymoon lay soaking in the dirty rainwater. "Get your junk and get off my property," Marcus bellowed. His voice was unnaturally loud, booming across the quiet cul-de-sac. I looked up at him, confused by the volume. We were only 5 feet apart. Then I saw his eyes darting toward the house next door. I followed his gaze. The heavy velvet curtains in Mrs. Higgins' living room window twitched. Mrs. Higgins was the neighborhood gossip, the self-appointed guardian of moral standards in our gated community. Marcus wasn't yelling at me. He was performing for an audience. "I gave you everything, Jasmine," he shouted, waving his arms dramatically. "I paid your medical bills, I paid your debts, and this is how you repay me, by stalking me, by refusing to let go." I sat frozen in my wheelchair, water dripping from my nose, completely stunned by the narrative he was constructing in real time. He was painting me as the unstable, obsessive ex-wife, and himself as the long-suffering victim. I tried to speak, to tell him to stop lying, but he cut me off, raising his voice even higher. "You are nothing but a gold digger," he screamed, pointing a finger at me like a weapon. "You only married me for my money, and now that the money is tight, you are trying to bleed me dry." "Well, the bank is closed, Jasmine. Go find another man to leech off of." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Gold digger. The irony was so thick it nearly choked me. I was the one who taught him how to invest. I was the one who balanced the books when his ego wrote checks his talent couldn't cash. But none of that mattered to the eyes watching from behind the curtains. To the white, affluent neighbors peeking out from their mansions, I was just an angry black woman causing a scene on a manicured lawn. I was the disruption. I was the problem. Marcus kicked the second bag toward my wheelchair. It struck the wheel, causing me to jolt backward. "Take your trash and leave," he spat, his voice dropping to a menace only I could hear. "If I see you on this street again, I will file a restraining order." He turned on his heel and slammed the door. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I was left alone in the rain, surrounded by the sodden remnants of my wardrobe. I looked at my silk dress, now stained with mud and oil. A sob threatened to escape my throat, but I swallowed it down. I would not give him the satisfaction of breaking me. I would not give the neighbors the show they wanted. I leaned over, pain shooting through my spine, and managed to tie the torn bag shut. It was humiliating. It was degrading. Dragging garbage bags into my lap while sitting in a wheelchair in the pouring rain. But as I wheeled myself down the long driveway, leaving black streaks on the pavement, I made a promise to myself. Marcus called me a gold digger. Fine. If he wanted a gold digger, I would show him exactly what happens when you dig too deep. You don't just find gold. Sometimes you hit a gas line. And I was about to light the match. The drive to the pharmacy was a blur of agony. My spine felt like it was being crushed in a vice, and every pothole the taxi hit sent a fresh jolt of electricity down my paralyzed legs. I needed the nerve blockers the doctor had prescribed. They were the only thing keeping me from screaming. I wheeled myself into the pharmacy under the harsh fluorescent lights, feeling exposed and vulnerable in my damp clothes. The pharmacist was a man named Mr. Henderson, whom I had known for years. He usually greeted me with a warm smile and a chat about the weather, but today his expression was tight and professional. I handed him the prescription script, my hand shaking slightly. He typed into his computer, his brow furrowing deeper with every keystroke. He stopped and looked over his glasses at me. "Jasmine, there seems to be a problem with your coverage," he said softly, lowering his voice so the other customers wouldn't hear. "The system is showing that your primary insurance policy was terminated as of 9 o'clock this morning." I felt the blood drain from my face. 9 o'clock. That was exactly 1 minute after the courthouse opened. Marcus had not just filed for divorce, he had systematically dismantled my lifeline. He knew I had severe spinal trauma. He knew I needed these specific medications to function. Cutting off my health insurance wasn't just a financial tactic. It was an act of physical violence. "Please check again, Mr. Henderson," I pleaded, gripping the counter. "That has to be a mistake. My husband pays the premium through his company. It is a platinum plan." Mr. Henderson shook his head sympathetically, turning the screen so I could see the red block letters. "It says terminated by primary policyholder. Reason given is change in qualifying life event. Divorce. I cannot run this through insurance, Jasmine. You will have to pay out of pocket." I swallowed hard, fighting back the nausea rising in my throat. "How much is it?" I asked, bracing myself. He typed in a code and winced. "For a 30-day supply without the copay adjustment, it comes to $2,140. The number hung in the air, like a death sentence. $2,000. I had less than $40 in my wallet, and my bank accounts were frozen. I looked at the bottle in his hand. It contained the relief I so desperately needed, but it might as well have been on the moon. I looked down at my hands, my fingernails digging into my palms. I could not leave without something. The pain was becoming blinding. "Is there a generic?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Something cheaper." Mr. Henderson looked hesitant. "There is an older generation blocker," he said slowly. "It is only $18. But Jasmine, the side effects are rough. It causes severe nausea, dizziness, and fatigue. It is not recommended for someone with your specific injury because it can slow down neural regeneration." I did not have a choice. Marcus had priced me out of my own recovery. "Give it to me," I said, sliding a crumpled $20 bill across the counter. I wheeled myself out of the pharmacy, clutching the small paper bag. I dry swallowed 2 of the cheap pills right there on the sidewalk. They tasted like chalk and bitterness. Within minutes, I felt the familiar wave of nausea wash over me, but the sharp edge of the pain began to dull. Marcus thought he was clever. He thought by taking away my medicine, he would force me to come crawling back to beg. But as I waited for another cheap taxi in the rain, I realized he had done something else. He had taught me that pain is just fuel, and I had a full tank. The taxi dropped me off in front of a crumbling brick building on the south side, where the only illumination came from a flickering neon sign at the liquor store across the street. The driver didn't even put the car in park, just kept his foot on the brake as I dragged my wheelchair out of the trunk. He sped off, leaving me in a cloud of exhaust fumes. This was my new reality. A studio apartment in a neighborhood where police sirens were the lullaby and the smell of mildew was the air freshener. To Marcus, this would look like rock bottom. To me, it was camouflage. He would never look for his high society wife here among the graffiti and the broken pavement. He thought I was destitute and desperate. He was only half right. I was desperate, but I was far from helpless. I navigated the cracked sidewalk and keyed into the lobby. The elevator was out of order naturally, so I had to drag myself and the chair up the ramp to the first floor unit I had secured with cash 3 hours ago. The apartment was a single room with peeling wallpaper and a mattress on the floor that looked like a crime scene. I locked the deadbolt and engaged the chain. Finally, I was safe. I wheeled myself to the center of the room and looked at the battered suitcase I had managed to salvage. It wasn't the designer luggage Marcus had thrown on the lawn. It was an old, nondescript duffel bag I had kept in the trunk of the Mercedes for emergencies. Marcus thought it contained gym clothes. He never bothered to look inside. I unzipped the bag and the harsh overhead light glinted off brushed aluminum and matte black steel. I didn't pull out clothes. I pulled out a military-grade laptop with a biometric scanner. Next came 3 encrypted hard drives and a portable satellite modem. I set them up on the wobbly laminate table using a stack of old phone books to prop up the monitor. My hands, which had been shaking from pain and cold, suddenly became steady as they touched the keyboard. This was my domain. Marcus knew me as a wife who organized charity dinners. He did not know that for the last 10 years I was the lead forensic auditor for a firm that specialized in destroying corporate fraudsters. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. The screen flared to life with a soft blue glow. Access granted. Hello, Jasmine? I typed in a command string that I could execute in my sleep, bypassing the standard internet gateways and routing my connection through servers in 3 different countries. My screen filled with cascading lines of code and financial data. I wasn't just checking my email. I was accessing the shadow accounts I had set up years ago when I first noticed discrepancies in Marcus's business filings. He thought he had cut off my money by freezing our joint accounts. He didn't know that a senior risk analyst always has a contingency plan. I opened a secure folder labeled Project Phoenix. Inside were digital copies of every contract, every wire transfer, and every shady deal Marcus had made since our wedding day. I saw the transaction for the new locks on the penthouse. I saw the purchase order for the engagement ring he was planning to give to his new girlfriend. I saw it all. The pain in my legs throbbed, but the adrenaline in my veins was stronger. I wasn't a paralyzed victim in a slum anymore. I was a spider sitting in the center of a very large web, and Marcus had just walked right into it. I cracked my knuckles and began to type. If he wanted a war, I would give him an apocalypse. The blue light of the monitors was the only thing illuminating my damp apartment. I logged into a shadow Instagram account I created years ago to monitor competitors, but tonight I was monitoring family. I typed in the handle for Becky Vance. Becky was the wife of Marcus's older brother and the self-appointed queen bee of the Vance family. She was a woman who wore pastel colors and posted inspirational quotes about kindness, while simultaneously judging everyone who didn't fit into her narrow worldview. To the outside world, she was the picture of a supportive sister-in-law. But to me, she was the architect of 1,000 tiny cuts. Becky never used slurs because she was too smart for that. Instead, she specialized in microaggressions wrapped in compliments. I remembered the first Thanksgiving she hosted. She asked me if I brought mac and cheese because she assumed that was the only dish my people knew how to make. She constantly touched my hair without asking, marveling at the texture like I was an exhibit at a petting zoo. She once told me I was so articulate for a girl from the South Side, implying that intelligence was a surprise, coming from someone who looked like me. She made sure I knew I was a guest in their world, never a member. I clicked on her latest post, which had gone live just 20 minutes ago. It was a high-resolution photo of a dinner party. The caption read simply, "Removing negative energy and welcoming a brighter future," followed by a prayer hands emoji and a white heart. The photo showed a beautifully set table with expensive wine and gourmet food. In the background, blurred but recognizable, was Marcus laughing with a glass in his hand. They were celebrating. They were celebrating my erasure. They were toasting to the fact that the glitch in their perfect family photo had finally been removed. I zoomed in on the image, analyzing every pixel. The crystal glasses they were using were Waterford crystal. My Waterford crystal. The ones I had bought with my promotion bonus 2 years ago. Becky had always coveted them, tracing the patterns with envious fingers whenever she visited the penthouse. She used to make backhanded comments about how flashy they were, yet here she was, drinking from my glass, toasting to my destruction. Anger flared in my chest, hot and sharp, but I pushed it down. Emotions are messy, but data is clean. Becky thought she was safe behind her gated community walls and her private Instagram account. She thought because she was not the one who signed the divorce papers, she was innocent in this war. But she was about to learn a hard lesson. When you toast with the devil, you better make sure you are not drinking poison. I opened a new terminal window on my screen. I knew Becky's password because she used the same combination of her dog's name and her wedding anniversary for everything. It was time to see what skeletons this perfect suburban housewife was hiding in her perfectly curated digital closet. I typed in the command and watched as the progress bar loaded. Let us see how much negative energy Becky was actually hiding. The command terminal blinked with a green cursor awaiting my input. I typed in the activation sequence for the hidden surveillance system I had installed inside the smoke detectors of the penthouse 6 months ago. At the time, I told myself it was for security against burglars, but deep down my intuition had been preparing for a different kind of thief. The screen flickered once, twice, and then resolved into a crystal-clear 4K video feed. The contrast between my peeling walls and the image on the screen was jarring. There, in the high-definition glow of the monitor, sat the three architects of my misery, lounging on the Italian leather sofa I had custom-ordered from Milan. Marcus was standing by the wet bar holding a dusty bottle that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a 1992 Screaming Eagle Cabernet, a bottle I had bought at an auction for $6,000, intending to open it on our 10th anniversary. It was my prized possession, a symbol of how far I had come from the South Side. Now I watched as Marcus carelessly tore the foil off the neck like it was a $10 bottle from a gas station. He didn't decant it. He didn't let it breathe. He just poured the dark ruby liquid into 3 glasses, spilling a few drops on the marble counter without a care. Mama Louise accepted her glass with a greedy smile, kicking her feet up on the coffee table, something she would never have dared to do while I was living there. "This is what I call class," she said, taking a large, unrefined gulp. "Finally, the air in this house feels lighter. That girl always did bring a heavy energy with her. It was like living with a dark cloud." Becky, who was curled up in my favorite armchair, nodded vigorously, swirling the wine she didn't have the palate to appreciate. "You are so right, Mama," she chirped. Jasmine was just so intense. She made everything a competition. It is nice to just relax without feeling like you are being judged by someone who thinks they are better than you just because they read a few books. Marcus raised his glass high, the light catching the expensive crystal. "To freedom," he announced, his voice booming through my laptop speakers. "To getting my life back, and to upgrades." They clinked glasses, the sound ringing out like a bell. I sat in the darkness of my slum apartment, watching them drink my wine and celebrate my erasure. They laughed, discussing how they were going to redecorate the master bedroom to remove my trace completely. Marcus made a joke about how easy it was to get me to sign the papers, and they all roared with laughter. They thought they were alone. They thought their words were vanishing into the ether. They didn't know that every insult, every lie, and every admission of guilt was being recorded onto a secure server. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply reached for a bag of stale chips on my wobbly table and ate one while I watched them. "Enjoy the wine, Marcus," I whispered to the screen. "Drink up, because that bottle costs more than what you will have left in your bank account when I am done with you." This was not a party. It was the last meal of the condemned, and they didn't even know the executioner was watching. The video feed on my monitor flickered slightly as the front door of the penthouse swung open. Mama Louise walked in first, wearing a triumphant grin that stretched from ear to ear. Behind her trailed a girl who looked like she had been manufactured in a factory designed solely to please narcissistic men. This was Vanessa. I recognized her immediately because her father was the bishop of the largest megachurch in Chicago, and her face had been on billboards advertising their youth ministry. She was 23 years old with flawless mahogany skin and a demeanor that screamed obedience. She wore a modest floral dress that cost more than my entire first car, and she kept her eyes lowered in a display of performative humility that made my stomach turn. I watched from my cold apartment as Marcus stood up from the sofa. He smoothed his suit jacket and walked over to her with a predator's stride. He did not look at her face. He looked at her body. He scanned her up and down, assessing her value like he was inspecting a piece of prime real estate. Mama Louise clapped her hands together like a seal at a circus. "Marcus, this is Vanessa," she announced, her voice shrill with excitement. "The bishop and I agree that she is exactly the kind of stabilizing influence you need right now. She leads the choir, she volunteers at the soup kitchen, and most importantly, she has never worked a corporate job in her life. She is purely domestic." Marcus took Vanessa's hand and kissed it. I watched him pour her a glass of my vintage wine. He led her to the dining table where Becky was already seated like a court jester waiting to entertain the king. The way Marcus looked at Vanessa made my skin crawl. It was not love, it was ownership. He sat down at the head of the table and gestured for Vanessa to sit on his right. The seat that used to be mine. "You are very beautiful, Vanessa," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "It is refreshing. My ex-wife Jasmine was always so exhausted. She was always talking about quarterly reports and risk assessments. She brought work home. It killed the romance. I need a woman who understands that her job is to be my peace, not my competitor." Vanessa giggled, a soft, practiced sound. "Oh, I would never bore you with business talk, Marcus," she said, her voice light and airy. "My father says a woman's glory is in her home. I just want to support a strong man like you." Becky chimed in from across the table, her eyes glinting with malice. "That is exactly what we were saying earlier. You know, Vanessa, you just have such a good pedigree. It is so important to come from good stock. Jasmine came from, well, let us just say her background was a bit scrappy. You can tell you have good genes. Strong, healthy genes. Unlike some people who break so easily." I froze. Becky was talking about my accident. She was talking about my fertility struggles. She was calling me genetically inferior because a truck had crushed my spine. I watched Marcus nod in agreement, swirling his wine. "You are right, Becky," he said. "No more broken goods. I need a legacy. I need heirs." And looking at Vanessa, "I think we can definitely secure the future of the Vance empire." I zoomed in on the screen until Vanessa's smiling face filled the pixelated window. She had no idea she was dining with vultures. She thought she was marrying into a fairy tale, but she was actually stepping into a horror movie. Marcus put his hand on her knee, and she didn't flinch. He was already planning the wedding. He was already spending money he didn't have to buy a ring for a girl he didn't love. I took a sip of my lukewarm water and felt a cold smile spread across my face. Go ahead, Marcus. Fall in love. Make promises. Plan a future. Because by the time I am done with you, the only thing you will be able to offer this girl is a seat on the bus to your bankruptcy hearing. The replacement had arrived, but she was about to become collateral damage. A loud banging on the peeling paint of my front door shattered the silence of my morning routine. In this neighborhood, a knock on the door usually meant one of two things. It was either the police looking for a fugitive or a landlord looking for rent. I wheeled myself to the entryway and peered through the peephole. A man I did not recognize stood there holding a thick manila envelope. He wore a cheap windbreaker and looked bored. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door just a crack, keeping the security chain engaged. The man looked down at me, scanning my face and then glancing at the wheelchair. "Are you Jasmine Vance?" he asked flatly. I nodded. "You have been served," he mumbled, shoving the envelope through the crack in the door before turning and walking away without another word. I closed the door and locked it, my hands trembling slightly. I assumed it was the finalization of the divorce decree. I assumed it was Marcus making good on his promise to legally sever all ties so he could marry his new trophy wife without any baggage. I wheeled myself back to the table and slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife. I pulled out the stack of legal documents and began to read. What I saw made the blood freeze in my veins. It was not a divorce decree. It was a petition for spousal support and alimony pendente light. I blinked hard, sure that I was misreading the legal jargon. I read it again. Marcus was suing me for monthly alimony payments. My eyes scanned the affidavit attached to the petition, and my jaw dropped. In paragraph 4, Marcus claimed that my tragic accident and subsequent disability had caused him severe emotional distress and crippling depression. He stated under penalty of perjury that the trauma of seeing his wife paralyzed had rendered him unable to perform his duties as a CEO effectively. He claimed he was suffering from loss of consortium and post-traumatic stress disorder, which had negatively impacted his income. Therefore, he argued that since I had previously been the high earner in the household with my secret investments, which he had conveniently remembered, I should be ordered to pay him $10,000 a month to maintain his standard of living while he recovered from the trauma of my injury. The audacity was so suffocating, I almost forgot to breathe. The man who had thrown me out of the ICU, the man who had dumped my clothes in the mud, the man who was currently planning a lavish wedding with a 23-year-old. This man was now claiming to be too depressed to work because he was so sad about my legs. It was the most narcissistic, twisted projection I had ever witnessed. He had stripped me of my home, my insurance, and my dignity, and now he wanted to pick the meat off my bones. But as I read further, a cold realization washed over me. This was not just cruelty. This was desperation. Marcus was bleeding money. He was terrified. He knew that without my salary and my management of his books, his lifestyle was unsustainable. He was trying to squeeze water from a stone because he was drowning in debt. He thought I was hiding money in an offshore account, and he was trying to use the court system to force me to open my wallet. He was right about the money, but he was wrong about the outcome. I did not tear up the papers in a fit of rage. I did not call him screaming. Instead, I walked over to my scanner and fed the documents into the machine. I saved the file to a folder named Exhibit F Perjury. Marcus had just made a fatal tactical error. By claiming in a court of law that he was too depressed to work, he had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy his credibility. I looked at the surveillance feed on my other monitor. It showed Marcus laughing at a country club lunch just yesterday. I smiled. If he wanted to play the victim, I would help him. I would make sure he was a victim of his own lies. The trap was set, and he had just stepped right onto the trigger. The sight of a pearl-white Range Rover navigating the potholed streets of my new neighborhood was almost comical. It looked like a spaceship attempting to land on a desolate planet. I watched through the peephole as Becky parked her six-figure SUV directly in front of a fire hydrant, ignoring the red curb. She stepped out wearing a beige trench coat and oversized sunglasses, looking around with visible disgust, as if she expected the poverty of the area to be contagious. She was holding a Tupperware container that had seen better days. This was not a social call. This was a reconnaissance mission. I quickly threw a stained blanket over my high-tech workstation, hiding the laptop and the hard drives. I slumped down in my wheelchair, letting my head hang low, and practiced my best expression of defeated misery. When I unlocked the door, Becky did not wait to be invited in. She breezed past me, bringing a cloud of expensive floral perfume that smelled out of place in the musty studio apartment. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning every corner, not with concern but with calculation. She was looking for assets. She was checking to see if I had any designer bags hidden in the closet or any jewelry on the dresser. "Oh, Jasmine," she sighed theatrically, clutching the plastic container to her chest. "This place is certainly cozy. I suppose it is all you can afford right now, given the circumstances. I brought you something." She thrust the container at me. I took it. It was cold. Inside were 2 dry slices of lemon pound cake. It was the cake from their engagement celebration. She had brought me the literal crumbs of her family's happiness. "I thought you might want a taste," she said, smiling that tight fake smile of hers. It was such a lovely dinner. "Vanessa is just delightful. But we were all so worried about you, Jasmine, especially Marcus. He feels terrible about the lawsuit, but you know he has to protect his future." I kept my head down, clutching the cold cake. "Thank you, Becky," I whispered, making my voice tremble. "It is very kind of you." She began to pace the small room, her heels clicking loudly on the cheap laminate floor. She pretended to look at a water stain on the ceiling, but I saw her eyes darting to my stack of mail on the counter. She was looking for bank statements. She was looking for evidence of the secret wealth Marcus was claiming I had. "You know," she said casually, turning to face me. "Marcus mentioned in the court filing that he thinks you have some private investments. I mean, surely a smart girl like you didn't leave the marriage with nothing, right? You must have a safety net somewhere, maybe an offshore account. You can tell me, Jasmine, I am family." This was it, the trap. If I admitted to having money, she would run straight to Marcus and I would lose my leverage in court. If I admitted to being broke, she would go back and tell him he was wasting his time suing me. I looked up at her, letting tears well in my eyes. "Becky, I have nothing," I choked out. "The investments were a lie. I made it up to impress Marcus's business partners. I am living on disability checks and food stamps. Please don't tell him. If he sues me, I will go to jail for debt." I saw the tension leave her shoulders instantly. Her eyes lit up with a cruel satisfaction. She believed me. She looked at my wheelchair, my peeling walls, and the old cake in my lap, and she saw exactly what she wanted to see. A loser. "Oh, you poor dear," she cooed, patting me on the head like a dog. "Do not worry. I will tell Marcus not to be too hard on you. After all, you have lost enough already." She checked her watch, eager to leave now that she had confirmed I was destitute. She walked out the door without looking back, leaving me alone with the stale cake. As soon as I heard her engine roar to life, I wheeled back to my desk and threw the blanket off my computer. She thought she had found a broken woman. She had actually just given me the confirmation I needed. They were terrified of my money. And now that they thought I didn't have any, they would get careless. I opened the Tupperware and dumped the cake into the trash. I didn't need their crumbs. I was about to own the bakery. With Becky gone and my poverty established as a fact in the family group chat, I turned my attention to the next phase of my demolition project. I pulled up a file on my secure server labeled Distressed Assets. Inside was a single folder for a company called Nexus Dynamics. 4 years ago, Marcus and I had invested $50,000 each into this small data compression startup run by a socially awkward dropout named Kevin. For the last 3 years, Nexus had shown zero profit. It was a black hole in our portfolio. Marcus hated it. He called it the dead weight. He used to scream at me for wasting our money on a company that didn't even have a proper office. But Marcus looked at quarterly reports. I looked at code. I knew that Kevin wasn't failing. He was building. He was creating a compression algorithm that was years ahead of anything Silicon Valley had to offer. To the naked eye, Nexus was a failing startup on the brink of bankruptcy. To a risk analyst who understood the market, it was a dormant volcano waiting to erupt. And I needed to own 100% of that volcano before it blew. I picked up a burner phone I had purchased at a bodega. I dialed the number of a private equity lawyer named Mr. Sterling. He was not the kind of lawyer you found on a billboard. He was the kind you found through whispers. He specialized in blind trusts and anonymous acquisitions. When he answered, his voice was like gravel. "I need you to make an offer," I said, keeping my eyes on the surveillance feed of the penthouse. "Contact Marcus Vance immediately. Tell him you represent an anonymous buyer interested in taking a failing asset off his hands. Offer him $15,000 for his entire 50% stake in Nexus Dynamics." Sterling paused. 15,000. "That is insults, Jasmine. The initial investment was 50. "He will take it," I said confidently. "He is desperate for liquidity. Just tell him it is a tax write-off. Tell him he is lucky to get anything at all for a company that has never made a dime. I knew he would take it because I knew exactly what he was doing at that very moment. On my second monitor, I had hacked into the security feed of the most exclusive jewelry store on the Magnificent Mile. There stood Marcus. He was sweating. He was looking at a 3-carat radiant cut diamond ring that cost $45,000. He wanted to propose to Vanessa. He wanted to lock down the bishop's daughter and secure his social standing. But his credit cards were maxed out and his bank accounts were drained from the legal fees of suing me. He needed cash fast. I watched as Marcus stepped away from the jewelry counter to take the call from Sterling. I saw his face shift from annoyance to relief. He was selling his future to buy a shiny rock for a girl who was just a pawn in his game. He thought he was being smart. He thought he was dumping a useless stock to fund his new life. He had no idea that he was selling the winning lottery ticket back to the person he had thrown in the trash. I hung up the phone and waited. The trap was not just set. It was baited with the one thing Marcus could not resist: easy money. The knock on my door was authoritative and impatient. It was a knock that demanded entry rather than asking for it. I did not need to check the peephole to know that Marcus had arrived. He was precisely on schedule, driven by greed and the urgent need for cash to secure his new fiancée. I wheeled myself to the door and opened it, revealing my husband standing in the dim hallway. He was holding a handkerchief over his nose, looking at the peeling paint and the flickering light bulb with unmasked horror. He looked like a king who had accidentally wandered into a leper colony. "May I come in?" he asked, although he was already stepping over the threshold before I could answer. He refused to sit on the only chair in the room, fearing contamination from my poverty. He stood in the center of the small space, clutching his briefcase to his chest. "Jasmine," he began, his voice adopting a tone of fake benevolence that made my skin crawl. "I have been thinking about your situation. Becky told me how hard things are for you, and despite everything, I am not a monster. I want to help you." He placed the briefcase on the wobbly table and snapped it open. He pulled out a document and a check. "I know we are co-owners of that useless startup Nexus Dynamics," he continued. "My accountant tells me the company is essentially dead. It is just a liability on our tax returns at this point. I am willing to take the full burden off your hands. I will buy your 50% share for $1,000. I looked at the check. $1,000. We had invested $50,000. He was offering me pennies on the dollar. But I knew why. He had just received the offer from my lawyer, Mr. Sterling, to buy the company for a higher price. Marcus wanted to buy my half cheap right now, so he could turn around and sell the whole thing to Sterling and pocket the entire profit himself. He was trying to cheat me out of the sale. "But Marcus," I stammered, playing the part of the confused, desperate housewife. "We put so much money into that. Is it really worth nothing now?" "It is worth less than nothing, Jasmine." He lied smoothly, looking me dead in the eye. "I am doing this to give you some grocery money. Take the deal." I reached for the pen, my hand trembling theatrically. I looked at the document. It was a standard stock transfer form. By signing this, I was giving him full ownership. But by signing this while he held secret knowledge of a third-party buyer without disclosing it to me, he was committing a felony. It is called insider trading and shareholder fraud. He was buying out a minority shareholder based on material non-public information. "I suppose I have no choice," I whispered, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. I signed my name at the bottom of the page. Jasmine Vance. Marcus snatched the paper the moment the pen lifted. He could barely hide his grin. He handed me the check for $1,000 like he was feeding a stray dog. "You are doing the right thing, Jasmine," he said, sliding the transfer into his briefcase. "This will help you get back on your feet. Or, well, you know what I mean." He chuckled at his own cruel joke and turned to leave. He was practically skipping. He was rushing to the jewelry store to buy Vanessa's ring with the money he thought he was about to make. He thought he had just pulled off the deal of the century. He did not realize that the document I just signed was the final nail in his coffin. He had just walked into a federal crime, and I had the receipt. As soon as the sound of Marcus's expensive leather shoes faded down the hallway, I locked the door and wheeled back to my command center. He had his signature, and he thought he had his victory, but I was just getting started. The financial trap with the startup shares was set, and now it was time to find the leverage that would ensure he had no character witnesses left when the trial started. I needed to know exactly who he was funding with the money he was stealing from me. I assumed it was all going to Vanessa, the pastor's daughter, but my gut told me there was more. Marcus was a narcissist, and narcissists always need more than one source of supply. I pulled up the terminal window that was mirroring Marcus's phone. Because we had shared a family plan for 5 years, and he had never bothered to change his credentials after the separation, I had full access to his cloud backup. I bypassed the standard photo gallery, which was filled with selfies and pictures of expensive watches he couldn't afford. I went straight to the secure folder app, the one he thought was encrypted. He had used the same passcode as the garage door opener. It took me 3 seconds to unlock it. I expected to find intimate photos of Vanessa. I expected to see texts about wedding planning and how much they loved each other. And I did find those. There were hundreds of messages between them discussing the ring, the venue, and how boring I was compared to her. But then I scrolled down to a subfolder labeled simply Business Contacts. It seemed innocuous enough, but the file size was massive. I clicked it open, and what I saw made the air leave my lungs in a rush. The first photo was not of a contract or a building. It was a selfie taken in a hotel room mirror. But the woman in the frame was not Vanessa. It was Becky, my sister-in-law, the woman who had just stood in my apartment, judging my poverty and feeding me stale cake. The woman who was married to Marcus's older brother, David. I felt a wave of nausea crash over me. I clicked through the images faster now, my hand gripping the mouse so hard it hurt. There were dozens of them. Weekend trips they claimed were business conferences. Late-night dinners while David was working shifts at the hospital. I opened the text logs associated with the folder. The timestamps went back 2 years. While I was paying for his mother's surgery, and while Becky was playing the role of the devoted wife and mother, they were meeting in motels off the interstate. I read a message from last week. It said, "David is so clueless he thinks I am at a yoga retreat. I cannot wait to spend your wife's money on us." Marcus had replied saying, "Soon, baby. Once the cripple signs the papers, we will have everything." I sat back in my wheelchair, staring at the glowing screen. The betrayal was so incestuous and deep it was almost impressive. Marcus wasn't just cheating on me, he was destroying his own brother. He was sleeping with his sister-in-law while planning a wedding to a third woman. This was not just leverage, this was a nuclear bomb. If I released this information, I wouldn't just win the divorce. I would detonate the entire Vance family tree. I saved every single photo and every single text message to 3 separate hard drives. I looked at Becky's smiling face on the screen. She had called me negative energy. She had no idea that she was the one who had just handed me the match to burn their whole world down. Sunday morning at Greater Grace Cathedral was not about worship. It was about warfare disguised as praise. I sat in the back of the sanctuary, my wheelchair wedged between a stack of hymnals and the audio booth, watching the performance of a lifetime. The air smelled of expensive perfume and old secrets. The organ music swelled, shaking the stained glass windows, but the loudest thing in the room was the hypocrisy marching down the center aisle. Marcus entered first, holding Vanessa's hand like she was a fragile porcelain doll he had just won at a carnival. He wore a navy blue suit that I knew he had charged to a credit card that was 2 days away from being declined. Vanessa looked the part of the perfect pastor's daughter, in a modest white dress, beaming at the congregation as if she had personally invented salvation. Behind them waddled Mama Louise. She wore a hat so large and elaborate it looked like a satellite dish designed to receive gossip directly from heaven. She waved to the deacons and blew kisses to the choir members, playing the role of the benevolent matriarch. They took their seats in the second pew, the spot reserved for high-value donors. It was a joke, because the only thing Marcus was donating these days was audacity. I watched as Becky leaned forward to whisper something in Vanessa's ear, probably a lie about how close our family used to be. They looked picture perfect: the successful son, the glowing fiancé, the loving mother. It was a tableau of success built entirely on a foundation of fraud and my stolen money. I had not come here to pray. I had come to be seen. I wanted to remind them that the body they stepped over to get to the altar was still breathing. I wheeled myself forward just a few inches, emerging from the shadows of the vestibule. The movement caught Mama Louise's eye. She turned her head slightly, her smile vanishing, instantly replaced by a look of pure venom. She did not turn around completely. She simply made a sharp, subtle gesture with her gloved hand, signaling the head usher, Deacon Miller. Miller was a man who had known me for years, a man whose granddaughter I had tutored in math. But today, he looked at me like I was a contagion. He approached me swiftly, his rubber-soled shoes silent on the carpet. He leaned down, his breath smelling of peppermint and betrayal. "Sister Jasmine," he whispered, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Mother Louise is feeling quite fragile today. She feels that your presence here is a distraction to the spirit of worship. She has asked that you be removed. Perhaps you could watch the service on the live stream from home." It was not a request. It was an eviction. In the house of the Lord, I was being told there was no room at the inn for a disabled woman because she ruined the aesthetic of her ex-husband's date. I looked at Miller and then at the back of Marcus's head. He hadn't even turned around. He knew I was there, and he let his mother do his dirty work. I nodded slowly. "I understand, Deacon," I said softly. "I would hate to block the view of such a holy family." I turned my wheelchair around and headed for the exit. As the heavy doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of the choir singing about amazing grace, I let out a short, dry laugh. They could kick me out of the building, but they couldn't kick me out of the truth. They were praying for blessings, but they should have been praying for mercy, because I was the one answering their prayers now, and my judgment was going to be biblical. I wheeled myself down the concrete ramp and onto the sidewalk, feeling the heavy gaze of the congregation burning into my back. I had been evicted from the house of God, but the devil was waiting for me in the parking lot. I was about to signal for a taxi when I heard the click-clack of heels rushing toward me. I turned my chair to see Vanessa running down the church steps, breathless and glowing in her white dress. She looked like an angel sent to save a sinner. But as she got closer, I saw the distinct glint of calculation in her eyes. She wasn't running to me because she cared. She was running to me because she had an audience. "Jasmine, wait," she called out loud enough for the people lingering in the vestibule to hear. She stopped a few feet away from me, clutching a stark white envelope in her manicured hands. Her face was arranged into a perfect mask of sorrow and benevolence. "My heart just breaks, seeing you like this," she said, her voice pitching up an octave. "Marcus and I were praying for you during the service. We know how hard it must be for you right now living in that situation." She extended the envelope toward me. It was thick. I could smell the cash inside. "God placed it on my heart to bless you today," she continued. "We want you to have this. Consider it a gift from our family to help you get back on your feet, or at least to help you be comfortable." I reached out to take it, but my hand froze in midair. Over Vanessa's shoulder, I saw Marcus. He was not standing with the rest of the family. He was crouching slightly, holding his newest iPhone up in a vertical position. The red recording light was blinking. He was filming us. He was framing the shot perfectly to capture his beautiful young fiancée handing charity to his crippled ex-wife. I realized instantly what this was. This wasn't kindness. This was content. He was going to post this on TikTok and Instagram. I could already see the caption in my mind. "Even after she tried to ruin me, we still give back. Helping the less fortunate. #blessed." Rage, hot and blinding, flared in my chest. They were using my tragedy as a prop to rehabilitate his image. They were monetizing my humiliation. Marcus gestured with his free hand for Vanessa to move slightly to the left so the lighting would be better. He wanted to make sure the handover of the money was in 4K resolution. I looked at the envelope and then I looked at Vanessa. She was smiling, expecting me to cry with gratitude. She expected the poor broken woman to kiss the ring. So I gave them exactly what they wanted. I reached out and took the envelope. I let my fingers brush against hers, making sure the camera caught the transfer. I looked down at the money, playing the role of the destitute beggar. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said, my voice low. "You have no idea how much this reveals about you." She missed the double meaning completely. She beamed, turning back to Marcus with a thumbs up. Marcus lowered the phone slightly, grinning like a shark who just smelled blood. He thought he had the perfect clip to win back his investors. He thought he had documented his generosity. But as he went to stop the recording, I looked straight into the lens. I did not smile. I did not blink. I stared directly into the camera, with a look of such concentrated cold hatred that I saw Marcus actually flinch. I wanted that look to be the last thing he saw before I took everything he owned. I wanted that footage to be the evidence of his arrogance. He captured the moment he bought my silence, but he forgot that silence is where the bomb gets built. The click of the deadbolt sliding home echoed through the small apartment like a gunshot. I engaged the security chain and pulled the tattered curtains shut, ensuring that not a single sliver of light could escape to the street below. The performance was over. The role of the helpless, crippled ex-wife had been played to perfection all day. I had endured Mama Louise's insults. I had accepted Vanessa's pity money. I had let Marcus film me like a zoo animal. But now the audience was gone, and it was time for the curtain call. I wheeled myself to the center of the room. I looked down at the wheelchair that had been my prison and my disguise for the last 2 months. To Marcus, this chair was a symbol of my defeat. To me, it was a Trojan horse. I placed my hands on the armrests. In public, I would have gritted my teeth and dragged my body weight up with trembling arms. Tonight, I simply pushed down. My quadriceps engaged. My calves tightened. With a smooth, controlled motion, I rose from the seat and stood to my full height. I stretched my arms toward the ceiling, feeling my spine crack and realign. I stood 5 feet 9 inches tall without heels. I was not broken. I was not paralyzed. The initial diagnosis of permanent paralysis had been wrong. It was severe spinal shock, a temporary condition that mimics paralysis. The sensation had started coming back to my toes 6 weeks ago. By last month, I was able to walk. By last week, I was doing squats and lunges in the dark while the rest of the city slept. I began to pace around the small room. My stride was long and confident. I walked to the kitchenette and poured a glass of water, standing on my own 2 feet. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I was not the fragile victim they thought they were crushing. I was a predator lying in wait. Keeping this secret had been the hardest thing I have ever done. There were moments when I wanted to scream, moments when I wanted to stand up and slap Becky across her face when she talked down to me. But I knew that my physical weakness was the only reason they were being so careless. Marcus was a coward. He only attacked people he thought couldn't fight back. If he knew I could walk, he would have been cautious. He would have settled the divorce quietly. He would have hidden his assets better. By staying in the chair, I gave him the confidence to be reckless. I gave him the confidence to sue me for alimony based on my disability. I looked over at the legal papers on my desk. Marcus had sworn under oath that I was permanently disabled. He had built his entire legal strategy around my inability to work. He had dug a trap for himself so deep that he would never be able to climb out. I walked over to the corner and picked up a pair of red stilettos I had hidden in the back of the closet. I slipped my feet into them. The arch of my foot felt strong. The height made me feel powerful. I walked back and forth, practicing my stride. Click, click, click. The sound was rhythmic and deadly. I was not just relearning how to walk. I was rehearsing for my entrance. The next time Marcus saw me, I would not be looking up at him from a wheelchair. I would be looking down on him as I took everything he had ever loved. I took off the shoes and sat back in the chair to rest my legs. The physical recovery was complete. Now it was time to finish the paperwork. I sat back down at my makeshift desk and cracked my knuckles. My legs felt strong from the exercise, but my mind was even stronger. It was time to connect the dots that would send Marcus and Becky to federal prison. I pulled up the forensic accounting software I had customized myself. I started tracking the $500,000 that had vanished from Marcus's corporate escrow accounts over the last 18 months. Marcus was arrogant, but he was not a financial genius. He thought that by moving money through 3 different banks, he could hide the trail. He forgot that money always leaves a digital footprint if you know where to look. I watched the lines of code stream across the screen as I traced a wire transfer of $50,000. It left Marcus's business account and went to a shell company in Delaware called Blue Horizon Consulting. From there, it was transferred to a generic vendor account labeled Medical Supply Logistics. That seemed odd. Marcus was in real estate. Why was he paying a medical supply company? I dug deeper into the Medical Supply Logistics corporate filing. It was a subsidiary of Vance Dental Practice. That was David's company, Marcus's brother. My eyes narrowed. David was a good man. He was a dentist who worked long hours and loved his kids. He was not a criminal, but Becky was his office manager. She handled all the payroll and all the vendor contracts. I pulled up the ledger for the dental practice. There they were. Dozens of invoices for consulting fees and equipment upgrades paid for by Marcus's shell company. But the money didn't stay in the dental practice account. Within 24 hours of hitting the bank, it was withdrawn in cash or transferred to a personal account that I recognized immediately. It was the account Becky used to pay for her shopping sprees and apparently for Marcus's new life. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were not just stealing, they were laundering money. And they were using David's legitimate medical practice as the washing machine. Becky was taking Marcus's embezzled funds, running them through her husband's company to make them look clean, and then funneling the cash back to Marcus. If the IRS audited them, David would be the one going to jail. They were setting up their own brother and husband to be the fall guy. The cruelty was breathtaking. They were destroying David's life without him even knowing it, just to fund their affair and their greed. I felt a cold calm settle over me. This was no longer just a divorce case. This was a RICO case. I hit the print command. The laser printer in the corner began to whir to life. It started spitting out page after page of incriminating evidence. Bank statements showing the wire transfers, corporate registration documents linking Becky to the shell companies, text messages where they discussed how to classify the stolen funds to avoid tax triggers. The printer rhythmic hum filled the room for the next hour. I watched the stack of paper grow, 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches. It was a tome of corruption. I picked up the warm stack of papers and tapped them on the desk to align the edges. It was heavy. It weighed about as much as a brick, and it was going to do a lot more damage. I placed the stack in a crisp new file box. I labeled it simply Exhibit A. I ran my hand over the paper. This was not just evidence, it was justice, and tomorrow morning I was going to deliver it by hand. The glow of the television screen flickered against the peeling paint of my apartment walls. I had tuned into the financial news network at exactly 6 o'clock, knowing that the market closing bell often brought the biggest announcements. I was not disappointed. The banner at the bottom of the screen turned a bright, urgent red. The anchor, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a serious expression, looked directly into the camera. Breaking news in the tech sector, she announced. Tech giant Google has confirmed the acquisition of a small Chicago-based startup Nexus Dynamics for a reported $50 million in an all-cash deal. The acquisition centers on a revolutionary data compression algorithm that is set to redefine cloud storage efficiency. I sat back in my chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of water. $50 million. Since I was now the sole owner of Nexus Dynamics, having purchased Marcus's 50% share just yesterday via my proxy lawyer, that money was all mine. Well, technically, it belonged to the blind trust I had established, but for all intents and purposes, I had just become a very wealthy woman. Marcus had held a lottery ticket worth $25 million in his hands, and he had sold it to me for $1,000 because he was too arrogant to see the value in something he didn't understand. Across town in the hushed velvet-lined fitting room of an exclusive bespoke tailor, Marcus was currently oblivious to the fact that he had just made the worst business decision of his life. He stood on a small pedestal, admiring himself in a three-way mirror. He was being fitted for a midnight blue tuxedo made of imported Italian wool. He turned left, then right, sucking in his stomach and puffing out his chest. Vanessa sat on a plush ottoman nearby, scrolling through her phone, looking bored. "This is the one," Marcus declared, smoothing the lapel. "It screams power, doesn't it? I want to look like a king when I walk down that aisle." "You look amazing, baby," Vanessa murmured without looking up. "But are you sure we can afford the rush fee? The wedding planner said we are already over budget on the flowers." Marcus laughed, a dismissive sound that bounced off the mirrors. "Do not worry about the budget, Nessie. I am cleaning house. Just yesterday I unloaded some dead stock. That useless company Jasmine dragged me into years ago. I finally got rid of it. Got $1,000 for it, which is $1,000 more than it was worth. It feels good to cut the anchor loose. Now I have liquidity." He stepped down from the pedestal, and the tailor rushed forward to adjust the cuff. Marcus checked his watch, impatient to get to his bachelor dinner. He had no idea that the anchor he had cut loose was actually a golden parachute. He was preening in a suit he couldn't afford, planning a wedding he couldn't pay for, financing it all on a credit limit that was about to snap. I watched the news anchor discuss the timeline of the acquisition. The deal had been in the works for months. If Marcus had bothered to read a single email from Kevin instead of auto-deleting them, he would have known. But he didn't read. He just assumed. And that assumption had just cost him $25 million. He looked at himself in the mirror one last time, seeing a titan of industry. I looked at the screen and saw a man walking off a cliff. The atmosphere in the private fitting room was thick with self-congratulation. The tailor was on his knees, carefully pinning the hem of the midnight blue trousers, ensuring the break fell exactly over Marcus's shoe. Marcus was busy adjusting his silk tie in the mirror, admiring the silhouette of a man who believed he had won the game. Vanessa was taking selfies in the mirror, trying to get the lighting right to show off the engagement ring that was purchased with credit debt. It was a perfect bubble of delusion. Then the bell above the shop door chimed. It wasn't the soft, polite ring of a customer appointment. It was followed by heavy, purposeful footsteps that ignored the plush carpeting. A man in a cheap windbreaker and cargo pants marched past the display of Italian silk scarves. The tailor stood up indignantly, mouth opening to demand the stranger leave the exclusive establishment. But the stranger didn't look at the tailor. He locked eyes with Marcus. "Marcus Vance." The man asked, his voice flat and bored. He held a thick stack of papers bound with a rubber band. Marcus frowned, annoyed that his private moment was being interrupted by someone who clearly couldn't afford a pair of socks in this store. "I am busy," Marcus snapped, waving his hand dismissively. "Whatever delivery you have, leave it at the front desk." The man didn't blink. "I am not a delivery driver, sir. I am a process server." He stepped forward and thrust the heavy bundle of documents directly into Marcus's chest. Marcus instinctively grabbed them to stop them from hitting the floor. "You have been served." Marcus looked down at the papers. The top page was not an invitation or a bill, it was a court summons. The bold black letters at the top screamed, "Superior Court of Cook County." His eyes scanned the first paragraph, and the color drained from his face so fast it looked like he was about to faint. It wasn't just a divorce petition, it was a multi-count lawsuit. Plaintiff Jasmine Vance versus defendant Marcus Vance. Causes of action included grand larceny, wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and a petition for immediate asset freezing. But the one that made his knees buckle was the criminal summons attached to the back. It cited the document he had signed yesterday, the sale of the Nexus Dynamics shares. The charge was securities fraud and insider trading. "What is that, babe?" Vanessa asked, looking up from her phone. "Is it fan mail?" Marcus couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The room started to spin. He read the line about the forensic accounting evidence attached as Exhibit A. He realized with a sick lurch in his stomach that Jasmine hadn't just been sitting at home crying. She had been watching. She had receipts. The tailor cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir, about the deposit for the suit." Marcus looked at the tailor, his eyes wild with panic. He looked at the lawsuit which demanded the immediate return of $2 million in misappropriated funds. He looked at Vanessa, who was still oblivious. He realized he didn't have the money for the deposit. He didn't have the money for the ring. He didn't even have the money for the taxi ride home. The king in the mirror had just been checkmated. The hallway outside courtroom 4B felt less like a legal venue and more like a country club mixer. Marcus and his entourage had arrived 20 minutes early, claiming the benches on the right side of the corridor as if they were VIP seating. They were loud and polished, radiating a dangerous amount of overconfidence. Marcus stood in the center, adjusting the cuffs of his navy suit. He looked pale, the memory of the process server still haunting him, but his family was doing an excellent job of inflating his ego back to its usual size. Becky was leaning against the wall, scrolling through her phone and laughing. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes bright with malice. "Do not look so worried, Mark," she said loud enough for the clerks to hear. "She is probably going to roll in here crying about her back pain, hoping the judge feels sorry for her. We have the medical reports. We have the character witnesses. She is just a bitter ex-wife trying to make a scene before she fades into obscurity." Mama Louise sat on the bench clutching a leather-bound Bible with a cross on the cover that was large enough to be seen from space. She had her eyes closed and was rocking back and forth, praying in a stage whisper that echoed off the marble floors. "Lord, please protect my son from the snares of the wicked. Remove the thorns from his path. Let the truth of her incompetence shine forth." She paused to glare at a passing stenographer before returning to her performance. She was playing the role of the suffering mother to perfection, convinced that God was on the side of the people who paid the most tithes. Standing slightly apart from the family circus was Marcus's attorney, Mr. Thorne. He was a shark in a $3,000 custom pinstripe suit, checking his Rolex every 30 seconds. He looked across the hallway at the man representing me. My attorney, Mr. Finch, leaned against a pillar, looking entirely out of place. He wore a rumpled gray suit that looked 2 sizes too big and held a briefcase that was scuffed and peeling at the corners. To the untrained eye, Finch looked like a public defender who had been dragged out of bed 5 minutes ago and was already defeated. Thorne let out a short, derisive snort. He nudged Marcus and pointed at Finch. "Look at that!" he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. She could not even afford a firm. She hired a strip mall lawyer. "This is going to be a slaughter, Marcus. I will have the alimony case dismissed before lunch, and we will counter-sue for your legal fees. That guy barely knows how to tie his tie, let alone argue complex fraud." Finch did not look up. He did not react to the insults. He just stared at the floor, looking bored and harmless, picking a piece of lint off his lapel. Thorne saw a clown. He did not realize that Finch was actually one of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the state, who simply preferred to dress like a slob to lower his opponent's guard. Thorne thought the battle was won because he had the better suit. He had no idea that inside Finch's battered briefcase was not a sandwich, but a thick file labeled Exhibit A, containing the forensic roadmap to their destruction. The lions were laughing at the sheep, unaware that the sheep was actually a wolf in a polyester blend. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B remained closed for a beat longer than necessary. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and Marcus's premature victory. The bailiff called out the docket number, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "All rise." The room shuffled as people stood, but Marcus and his team were not looking at the judge. They were looking at the entrance, their eyes cast downward at hip level, expecting the familiar metallic glint of a wheelchair. They were ready to see a broken woman roll in, diminishing herself before the law. They had their pity faces rehearsed. They had their defense strategy built entirely on the foundation of my weakness. Then came the sound. It was not the squeak of rubber tires on linoleum. It was a sharp, rhythmic percussion that cut through the silence like a gunshot. Click, clack, click, clack. It was the unmistakable sound of a hard heel striking marble with force and precision. The doors swung open. I did not roll in. I stepped in. I was wearing a suit the color of fresh arterial blood tailored so sharply it could cut glass. The fabric hugged a body that was not withered or frail but strong and commanding. And on my feet I wore 4-inch crimson stilettos. I stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, towering over the expectation of my disability. The sound of my heels hitting the floor was the only noise in the room. It sounded like the gavel of a judge pronouncing a death sentence. I saw the exact moment the oxygen left Marcus's lungs. He was looking down at the empty space where he thought my wheelchair would be. His eyes slowly traveled up past the sharp crease of my trousers, past the gold buttons of my blazer until they met mine. His jaw unhinged. His mouth hung open in a grotesque display of shock, his face draining of color, until he looked like a wax figure melting under heat. The smirk that had been plastered on his face for weeks vanished, replaced by a primal, animalistic terror. Becky, who had been laughing a moment ago, froze mid-gesture. Her phone slipped from her fingers and hit the bench with a loud crack, but she didn't even look down. She stared at me as if she were seeing a ghost. Mama Louise stopped her rocking. Her Bible slipped from her lap and thudded onto the floor. She clutched her chest, her eyes bulging, realizing that her prayers for my destruction had bounced off the ceiling. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply walked. I strode down the center aisle with a gait that was fluid and predatory. I felt the power in my legs, the muscles firing perfectly with every step. I walked past their bench. I could hear Marcus wheezing, struggling to process the reality in front of him. He realized in that split second that his entire case, the alimony claim based on my disability, the narrative of his depression caused by my paralysis, was not just ruined. It was perjury. I reached the plaintiff's table and stood next to Mr. Finch. I turned slowly to face Marcus. He was gripping the back of the bench in front of him, his knuckles white, looking like he was about to vomit. I adjusted my cuffs, the red fabric blazing under the courtroom lights. I had spent months learning to walk again just for this moment. The silence in the room was deafening, but it was the silence of a predator watching its prey realize there is nowhere left to run. The trial hadn't even started, and he was already dead. The gavel struck the mahogany block with a sound that cracked the tension in the room like an egg. Judge Sterling, a woman known for her zero-tolerance policy regarding courtroom theatrics, leaned over the bench. Her eyes darted from my red stilettos to Marcus's ashen face. She did not look amused. She looked interested. Mr. Thorne. Marcus's shark of a lawyer was the first to find his voice. He jumped to his feet, knocking his expensive pen onto the floor. "Objection, Your Honor," he sputtered, his face flushing a deep crimson. "This is highly irregular. We were led to believe the plaintiff was incapacitated. This is a stunt designed to prejudice the court." My lawyer, Mr. Finch, stood up slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He simply picked up a document from the table. "It is not a stunt, Your Honor," Finch said calmly. "It is a miracle of modern medicine and sheer willpower. A miracle that the defendant would have known about if he had not been so busy trying to starve his wife into submission." I stepped forward, my heels clicking on the floor. I looked directly at Marcus. He was gripping the table, his knuckles white, staring at me as if I were a resurrection he hadn't prayed for. "You cut my health insurance at 9 o'clock in the morning on the day I was discharged." "Marcus," I said, my voice steady and clear, projecting to the back of the room, "you wanted me to suffer. You wanted me to be too poor to afford rehabilitation. You thought that by removing your financial support you were burying me. But you made a tactical error." I took a step closer to the defense table. "When you stopped paying the premiums, you stopped receiving the explanations of benefits. You stopped getting the updates from the hospital. My medical records became my private property, paid for with cash and grit. You didn't know I was walking because you were too cheap to pay for the paper trail that would have told you. Finch nodded to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights. A large projection screen descended behind the judge's bench. A video file began to play. It wasn't grainy surveillance footage. It was high-definition video taken from my apartment. The timestamp showed a date from 3 weeks ago. On the screen, I was not in a wheelchair. I was doing squats with a 20-pound kettlebell. The video cut to another clip. Me running on a treadmill, sweat pouring down my face, my legs driving like pistons. Cut to another clip. Me practicing kickboxing in the center of my tiny room, my movements sharp and lethal. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The image on the screen was undeniable proof of physical power. It stood in stark, violent contrast to the man sitting at the defense table who looked like he was shrinking. Finch paused the video on a frame where I was holding a plank position, looking directly at the camera with a fire in my eyes. He picked up Marcus's sworn affidavit. "Your Honor," Finch said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "In this document signed under penalty of perjury just 10 days ago, Mr. Vance states that his wife is, quote, permanently invalid and a physical burden, unquote. He claims his depression stems from her tragic inability to walk." Finch dropped the paper on the table. It landed with a soft thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. The video proves that the plaintiff is in peak physical condition. Therefore, the defendant's claim for alimony is based on a lie, and his sworn statement to this court is a felony. Marcus looked at the judge. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He was drowning in his own deceit, and I was the one holding the hose. Mr. Thorne wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He was a seasoned shark, but he knew when the water was full of blood, and right now it was his client's blood. He pivoted instantly, abandoning the failed disability argument and lunging for the only life raft left. "The money, Your Honor," he stammered, his voice losing its polished edge. "Regardless of the plaintiff's physical condition, the fact remains that this is a marriage of 5 years. We are in a community property state. Mr. Vance is entitled to an equitable distribution of all marital assets, including any business ventures Mrs. Vance may have concealed. We demand a full forensic audit of her holdings." I watched Marcus nod vigorously at the table. He looked desperate, like a drowning man clawing at a piece of driftwood. He was thinking about the secret investments he had accused me of having. He was thinking that even if he lost the alimony, he could still walk away with half of my portfolio. He was still greedy. He still didn't understand that he had already signed his own death warrant. My lawyer, Mr. Finch, did not argue. He did not object. He simply reached into his battered briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not a thick legal brief. It was the crisp white document Marcus had signed in my apartment less than 48 hours ago. Finch walked to the bench and handed it to the judge, then placed a copy directly in front of Marcus. "We agree, Your Honor." Finch said, his voice calm and deadly. "Division of assets is crucial. However, the defendant has already taken the liberty of dividing the assets himself." Marcus looked down at the paper. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He remembered the smell of the peeling paint in my apartment. He remembered the feeling of superiority when he threw the check at me. He thought this document was his shield. He thought it proved he had unloaded a debt. Finch turned to the courtroom. "This is a stock transfer agreement dated 2 days ago. In it, Mr. Vance explicitly sold his 50% stake in a company called Nexus Dynamics. He sold it to a blind trust for a cash payment of $1,000, waiving all future rights, royalties, and equity." Thorne scoffed, rolling his eyes. "So what? That company is a shell. It has zero value. My client was doing her a favor by getting his name off the tax liability." Finch smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "Actually, Mr. Thorne, the value has fluctuated slightly since the signature was obtained." He picked up a remote and clicked the projector screen to the next slide. It was a screenshot of the NASDAQ opening bell report. As of this morning, Finch announced his voice booming Nexus Dynamics was acquired by Google for an all-cash sum of $50 million. Since Ms. Vance's trust now owns 100% of the shares, that entire sum belongs to her. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the vacuum of space. Marcus stared at the screen. 50 million. The number seemed to hang in the air, glowing neon red. He looked at the document in his hand. He looked at the check stub in his pocket for $1,000. He had held a winning lottery ticket worth $25 million, and he had sold it to me for the price of a used couch because he thought I was stupid. Finch leaned in close to the microphone. According to the terms of this contract, Mr. Vance, your total payout from this $50 million deal is finalized. He pointed to the boilerplate legal text at the bottom. For the sum of $1 and other valuable consideration, you got your $1,000, Marcus, and legally you are entitled to exactly $1 more. Don't spend it all in one place. Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite human. It was a strangled, high-pitched wheeze. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped forward, his forehead hitting the defense table with a hollow thud. He hadn't just lost the divorce. He had lost the fortune of a lifetime, and the woman he called a cripple was the one standing on top of the mountain of cash he had built for her. The courtroom was still reeling from the $50 million revelation when Mr. Finch cleared his throat. The sound was small, but it commanded attention like a thunderclap. Marcus was slumped over the table staring at the wood grain as if searching for a way to rewind time. But I was not done. I had taken his money. Now I was going to take his family. Your Honor. Finch said, his voice dropping to a solemn register. While the financial fraud is egregious, we believe the defendant's moral character is also relevant to his petition for spousal support. Mr. Vance claims he is a family man who relies on the support of his close-knit relatives. We would like to introduce Exhibit B into evidence. Finch clicked the remote. The NASDAQ numbers vanished from the projection screen, replaced by a series of high-resolution screenshots. These were not spreadsheets. They were text messages. The timestamp was from 3 months ago. The sender was Marcus. The recipient was labeled simply, Sister-in-Law. A collective gasp swept through the room. The texts were not subtle. They were graphic. They detailed hotel meetups, specific sexual acts, and cruel jokes about the people they were betraying. But the message that was blown up in the center of the screen was the most damning of all. It read, David is so stupid he thinks I am at a late meeting. He will never know we are spending his retirement fund on this room. I turned my head slowly to look at the second row of the gallery. David Marcus's older brother and Becky's husband was sitting there. He was a quiet man, a dentist who had always been kind to me. He was staring at the screen, his face frozen in a rictus of confusion. He blinked once, then twice, trying to comprehend that the brother he idolized and the wife he adored were laughing at him while they slept together. The silence in the room was shattered by a sound that I will never forget. It was a low, animalistic growl that started deep in David's chest and erupted into a scream of pure, primal agony. No, he roared. David vaulted over the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the court floor. He moved with a speed and violence that no one expected from a middle-aged dentist. The bailiffs were too slow. David crashed into the defense table, sending papers flying. He grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his midnight blue tuxedo and hauled him out of his chair. You bastard, David screamed, spitting the words into his brother's face. You filthy, lying bastard! His fist connected with Marcus's jaw with a sickening crack. Marcus went down hard, knocking over his chair. David was on top of him, instantly raining down punches. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge was hammering her gavel, shouting for order. Mr. Thorne scrambled backward, tripping over his own briefcase to get away from the violence. Vanessa was screaming, shrinking into the corner of the room, clutching her stomach. I stood perfectly still, watching the carnage. It was Shakespearean, the two brothers rolling on the floor, destroying each other, while the truth hung above them on a 20-foot screen. Two bailiffs finally managed to pull David off. He was panting his knuckles, bloody tears streaming down his face. He looked at Becky, who was standing by the bench trembling. Becky realized the game was up. She saw the rage in her husband's eyes and the disgust on the faces of the jury. She did what she always did. She pivoted. She burst into loud, theatrical sobs, covering her face with her hands. "It wasn't my fault," she wailed, pointing a shaking finger at Marcus, who was spitting blood on the floor. "He made me do it, David. He manipulated me. He said he would ruin your practice if I didn't sleep with him. I was a victim. I was scared." It was a lie so desperate and pathetic that even Mama Louise stopped praying and looked at her daughter-in-law with open revulsion. David didn't even look at her. He just slumped in the arms of the bailiff, broken. I looked at Marcus, who was groaning on the floor, holding his swelling jaw. He had lost his fortune. He had lost his brother. And now he was watching his lover throw him under the bus to save her own skin. I adjusted my jacket and turned back to the judge. "As I said, Your Honor, a matter of character." The chaotic energy of the brawl dissipated into a cold, suffocating dread as the bailiffs dragged a screaming David out of the courtroom. Marcus pulled himself back into his chair, nursing a split lip and looking at me with eyes that were no longer defiant but pleading. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to go home and lick his wounds. But I had one final door to close, and this one had steel bars. Judge Sterling banged her gavel one last time, looking at the blood on the floor with disdain. "I am holding this court in recess," she announced, reaching for her water glass. "Not just yet, Your Honor." Mr. Finch interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise. "We have one last witness, or rather an interested observer who has been waiting patiently in the back row." I turned and nodded toward the rear of the gallery. A tall man in a charcoal suit stood up. He did not look like the other spectators. He had the distinct posture of federal law enforcement. He walked to the gate and flashed a badge that caught the courtroom lights. "Special Agent Harris, FBI, Economic Crimes Division." He stated, his voice devoid of emotion. Becky let out a small whimper, covering her mouth with her hands. Marcus stopped dabbing his bloody lip. The air in the room grew thin. Agent Harris walked to the plaintiff's table and placed a heavy file on the bench. "Thanks to the comprehensive dossier provided by Ms. Vance regarding the forensic accounting of Nexus Dynamics and Vance Real Estate, we opened an investigation 72 hours ago. What we found was not just spousal embezzlement. It was a sophisticated money laundering ring operating across state lines." He turned to look at Marcus and Becky. "You two were not just hiding money from Jasmine, you were hiding it from the IRS, and you were using a very specific vehicle to do it." Harris pointed to the screen where a new document appeared. It was a ledger for the Good Shepherd Benevolence Fund. "We traced the flow of illicit funds," Harris continued. "You were moving the embezzled corporate cash into this charity account, ostensibly for orphanage repairs in Haiti. But the money never left Chicago. It was washed through the church's tax-exempt status and then withdrawn as consulting fees paid to shell companies registered to Rebecca Vance." Mama Louise gasped, clutching the pew in front of her. The Good Shepherd Fund was her pet project, her pride and joy. She had bragged about it for years. Now she realized her son and his mistress had turned her holy legacy into a washing machine for dirty money. "You used your own mother's church to launder stolen assets," Jasmine said, her voice soft, but carrying to every corner of the room. "You defiled the one thing she actually cared about just to hide your greed." Agent Harris nodded. "We are looking at counts of tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The federal sentencing guidelines for this amount of money start at 15 years, without parole." Becky began to hyperventilate. She grabbed Mr. Thorne's arm, digging her nails into his suit. "You have to fix this," she shrieked. "I have kids. I cannot go to prison. I was just following orders." Marcus just sat there staring at the FBI badge. The reality was settling in like concrete. He wasn't just broke. He wasn't just divorced. He was going to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. He looked at me one last time, searching for any trace of the woman who used to love him. But she was gone. I was just the witness who had signed his release forms. Agent Harris signaled to two uniformed officers waiting by the door. Mr. Vance. Mrs. Vance, I am going to ask you to stand up. You are under arrest. As the officers moved in with handcuffs, the sound of the clicking metal was the only applause I needed. I picked up my purse and turned my back on them. The show was over. The bad guys had lost. And the cripple walked out of the courtroom without looking back, leaving them to rot in the ruins they had built. The metallic click of the handcuffs securing Marcus's wrists signaled the end of the Vance dynasty. As the bailiffs escorted my ex-husband and his sister-in-law out the side door toward the holding cells, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The only person left standing in the wreckage of the defense area was Mama Louise. She stood clutching her oversized handbag, her eyes darting between the door where her son had just vanished and the plaintiff's table where I stood gathering my files. I watched the gears in her head turn. She was a survivalist. She had just watched her son lose his freedom and her reputation get incinerated by the FBI, but she also knew one other fact. I was now worth $50 million. She straightened her hat, wiped the look of horror from her face, and replaced it with a mask of trembling, teary-eyed affection. It was a transformation so rapid it was almost impressive. She stepped over the mess of papers on the floor, stepping over the literal ruins of her family, and began to make her way toward me. Her arms were outstretched, her lower lip quivering in a performance that deserved an Academy Award. "Jasmine, baby," she cried out, her voice cracking perfectly. "Oh, thank God you are all right. You have no idea how worried I have been." She rushed toward me, ignoring the fact that just 48 hours ago, she had ordered a security guard to throw me out of her church. She ignored the fact that she had called me a cripple and a burden. She closed the distance between us, intent on wrapping me in a hug that would visually claim me as her own again. I knew my son was troubled. She rambled, getting closer. "I told him, Jasmine. I told him he was wrong to treat you that way, but you know how headstrong men can be. I always loved you like my own daughter. I knew you were innocent. We can fix this baby. We can rebuild, you and me. We are the survivors." She was within 2 feet of me, her perfume hitting me in a suffocating wave. It was a heavy floral scent that she thought smelled like old money, but actually smelled like desperation and decay. She reached out to touch my arm, her eyes locked on the diamond bracelet I was wearing, already calculating how much of my $50 million she could guilt me into spending on her legal defense. I did not flinch. I did not step back in fear. I simply raised one hand, palm out, stopping her in her tracks. The gesture was sharp and commanding. "Stop," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was cold enough to freeze the air between us. Mama Louise froze, her smile faltering. "Jasmine, honey, it is me. It is Mama." I looked her up and down, taking in the trembling hands and the fake tears. I remembered her standing on the porch with the umbrella watching me get soaked in the rain. I remembered her laughing while drinking my wine. I looked her dead in the eye. "Mrs. Vance," I said, stripping her of the familial title. "You are blocking my exit. And frankly, you need to step away. Your perfume is cheap and it is triggering my allergies." The insult hit her like a physical slap. Her mouth dropped open, the color drained from her face beneath the heavy makeup. I wasn't just rejecting her. I was dismissing her. I was telling her that she was no longer in my league. I stepped around her, making sure my red suit didn't brush against her coat. I left her standing there alone in the middle of the courtroom, an old woman with a criminal son and a ruined legacy, realizing that her bridge back to wealth hadn't just been burned. I had blown it up. I walked toward the heavy double doors, the sound of my heels the only thing she would remember of me. The courtroom doors had barely swung shut behind the FBI agents when Judge Sterling called the room back to order. The criminal matter was out of her hands, but the civil matter was about to be concluded with extreme prejudice. "Mr. Thorne stood alone at the defense table, looking like a captain who had just watched his ship sink and was now being asked to pay for the water. He began to pack his briefcase, visibly shaking, knowing there was no defense left to mount. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at him with a gaze that could strip paint. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented regarding Mr. Vance's fraudulent financial activities, Judge Sterling began, her voice echoing in the silent room. I am issuing a summary judgment in favor of the plaintiff. This court finds that the defendant, Marcus Vance, acted with malice and intent to defraud his spouse. Therefore, the standard equitable distribution of marital assets is null and void. She picked up a pen and signed the order with a sharp, decisive scratch. Regarding the marital residence located at the penthouse address, the court finds that the down payment and subsequent mortgage payments were subsidized by funds embezzled from the plaintiff's own business interests. Under the doctrine of constructive trust, the defendant has forfeited any claim to the property. Sole ownership of the penthouse is hereby transferred to Jasmine Vance, effective immediately. The defendant has 24 hours to vacate any remaining personal effects. Although considering he is currently in federal custody, I assume that will not be necessary. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. The penthouse was the symbol of his status. It was the stage where he had performed his infidelity and his cruelty. And now it was mine. I would probably sell it or burn it down, but the point was that he could never set foot in it again. The judge was not finished. She turned a page in the file. Furthermore, regarding the legal fees, Mr. Vance's litigious behavior, including the filing of a frivolous motion for alimony based on perjured testimony, has caused the plaintiff unnecessary financial burden. I am ordering the defendant to pay the plaintiff's legal fees in their entirety. The court assesses this amount at $500,000, to be garnished from any remaining assets the defendant may possess. Mr. Thorne let out a defeated sigh and slumped into his chair. He knew there were no assets left. Marcus was bankrupt. This judgment meant that even if Marcus ever got out of prison, he would spend the rest of his life under the weight of this debt. He would never own a business again. He would never own a home again. He was professionally and financially extinct. Judge Sterling looked at me for the first time with a softening in her eyes. It was a look of respect. Ms. Vance, this court apologizes for the ordeal you have endured. You are free to go. She banged the gavel one last time. Bang! The sound was final. It was the sound of a heavy book closing on a dark chapter. I nodded to Mr. Finch, who was grinning like a Cheshire cat. We shook hands. I picked up my purse and the deed to my house. I walked down the aisle, my heels clicking a victory march on the marble. I had walked in as a victim in the eyes of the law, and I was walking out as the owner of everything Marcus had ever tried to keep from me. The war was over, and I was the last woman standing. The fluorescent lights of the Federal Correctional Institution buzzed with a headache-inducing frequency that matched the bleak grayness of the walls. I sat on a bolted-down metal stool, my hands resting calmly on the cool countertop. On the other side of the scratched plexiglass, the heavy steel door buzzed open. Marcus shuffled in. The transformation in just 3 months was shocking. The midnight blue tuxedo and the arrogance were gone, replaced by a baggy orange jumpsuit and a posture of utter defeat. His hair, once perfectly styled with expensive gel, was shaved close to his scalp, revealing the shape of a skull that looked fragile. He had lost at least 20 pounds. His cheekbones jutted out sharply, and his eyes darted around the room with the skittish anxiety of a prey animal. He sat down and snatched the receiver off the wall. I picked up mine slowly. Jasmine, he breathed, his voice cracking. Thank God. I knew you would come. You have to help me. It is hell in here. I cannot survive this. They know who I am. They know I used to have money. I need protection. I need a better lawyer to file an appeal. Thorne is useless. You have the money now. You have 50 million. Please, Jazz, for old time's sake. I watched him beg. It was pathetic. This was the man who had looked at my paralyzed legs and seen nothing but a financial liability. Now he was the one unable to stand on his own. I did not come here to help you, Marcus, I said, my voice smooth and detached. I came to bring you this. I slid a single sheet of paper against the glass. It was the final divorce decree stamped and certified by the court this morning. It is done, I continued. The marriage is dissolved. You are legally a stranger to me. I wanted you to see it. I wanted you to know that the last tie you had to the outside world has been cut. Marcus stared at the paper tears welling in his sunken eyes. But why? We were a power couple. We can be again. I made a mistake. I was stressed. Vanessa meant nothing. It was always you. You were always the perfect wife. You know how to build an empire. We can fix this. I laughed, a soft, dry sound that seemed to rattle him. You are right about one thing, Marcus. I was the perfect wife. I ran your books. I covered your lies. I built your ego. And when I fell, you threw me away like broken furniture. But you were wrong about the future. I leaned in closer to the glass, my diamond earrings catching the harsh prison light. I am still the perfect wife. I am wealthy. I am beautiful. I am loyal. But I am not yours. I paused, letting the words hang in the stale air between us. I am the perfect wife of someone else. Marcus blinked, confusion warring with panic on his face. What, who you got remarried? I didn't answer. I didn't need to tell him about Kevin, the genius behind the startup who had treated me with reverence and respect since the acquisition. I didn't need to tell him that I had found a partner who valued my mind, not just my utility. The mystery would hurt him more than the truth. I simply hung up the phone. Wait! Marcus screamed, slamming his hand against the glass. Jasmine, don't leave me here. Who is he, Jasmine? I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my designer dress. I turned and walked toward the heavy steel exit door. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, his voice muffled by the thick glass fading into the background noise of the prison. He was a ghost screaming in a box. I walked out into the bright sunshine of the parking lot, took a deep breath of fresh air, and got into my car. The rearview mirror showed only the empty road behind me. I put the car in drive and sped away. The past was in a cage. The future was wide open. The downfall of the Vance family did not end in the courtroom. That was merely the demolition. What followed was the clearing of the debris. I did not need to hire private investigators to know what happened to Becky and Mama Louise. In a city this size, gossip travels faster than light, especially when the mighty have fallen so spectacularly. Becky, the woman who once looked down on my apartment with a sneer of disgust, now spends her days standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of a discount grocery store on the edge of town. The court proceedings with David were brutal and short. After the evidence of her affair with his brother and her complicity in the money laundering scheme was made public, David filed for full custody. He won. The judge declared Becky an unfit mother, citing her moral turpitude and the unstable environment she had created. She lost the house, she lost the car, she lost her children. I drove past the supermarket once just to see it for myself. I saw her through the glass window wearing a polyester vest that was 2 sizes too big. She was scanning a bag of frozen peas for a customer who was yelling at her about a coupon. Becky looked tired. Her roots were grown out, the expensive blonde highlights fading into a dull, flat brown. She looked at the scanner with dead eyes. Beep, beep, beep. That was the rhythm of her life now. She had traded her days of luncheons and spa appointments for minimum wage and aching feet. When her shift ends, she goes back to a basement apartment that makes my old studio look like a palace. She is alone, and the silence in her home is deafening, without the laughter of the children she betrayed. As for Mama Louise, the matriarch, who believed she was chosen by God to rule over her family, her judgment day arrived in the form of a foreclosure notice. With Marcus in prison and the illegal charity shut down by the feds, the cash flow that sustained her lifestyle evaporated overnight. The bank did not care about her standing in the church or her collection of hats. They seized the Victorian house she had lived in for 40 years. She was evicted on a rainy Tuesday. There was no family left to take her in. David refused to speak to her after learning she knew about the affair and said nothing. Marcus was a federal inmate. So the state stepped in. Mama Louise was moved into the Golden Horizon Care Center, a state-funded facility known for its understaffing and smell of boiled cabbage. I heard from a nurse I know that Louise is a nightmare for the staff. She spends her days in a shared room with a woman who screams at the television. Louise tries to order the nurses around like maids demanding her tea in china cups that do not exist. But nobody listens to her anymore. To them, she is just another indigent patient in bed number 4. She sits by the window clutching her Bible, watching the world go on without her. She wanted a legacy. She wanted a dynasty. Instead, she got a bed in a ward where she is just a number on a chart. They were the architects of their own misery. I simply handed them the bricks. The view from the 45th floor of the Willis Tower was breathtaking. From this height, the cars on the street looked like ants, and the people were invisible specks. It was a long way up from the basement apartment with the peeling paint and the flickering lights. My office was a sanctuary of glass and steel designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. On the frosted glass door, the gold lettering read Phoenix Capital. It was fitting. I had burned to the ground, and this was what rose from the ashes. I sat behind a desk made of reclaimed mahogany, reviewing the prospectus for a biotech firm specializing in spinal regeneration. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a kingmaker. My assistant buzzed the intercom. "The delegation from St. Jude's Medical Center is here, Ms. Vance." I told her to send them in. 3 men in gray suits walked in looking nervous. Leading them was Dr. Sterling, the hospital administrator, who had once sympathetically told me that without insurance, I would have to be transferred to a state facility. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just another wealthy donor, a signature on a check that could save his budget. He didn't see the woman who had cried in his hallway when the coverage was denied. I gestured for them to sit. They launched into their pitch, showing me renderings of a new state-of-the-art rehabilitation wing. They talked about hydrotherapy pools and robotic gait training. It was beautiful. It was exactly what I had needed and exactly what I had been denied. I let them talk, watching their desperation. They needed this money. The hospital was drowning in debt, and this grant was their lifeline. I picked up my fountain pen. It was heavy, cold, and expensive. I opened the checkbook on my desk. I wrote the date. I wrote the name of the hospital, and then I wrote the number. $5 million. I heard Dr. Sterling take a sharp intake of breath as I turned the check around and slid it across the polished wood. He reached for it, his hands trembling slightly. "Ms. Vance," he stammered, This is transformative. You are saving lives. We cannot thank you enough." I placed my hand over the check, stopping him from taking it. "There is one condition," I said, my voice cool and even. "Anything," he said, eager to please. "We will name the wing after you, the Jasmine Vance Center for Recovery." I shook my head. "I don't want my name on the building. I want a name off your payroll." Dr. Sterling looked confused. "I don't understand." I pulled up a file on my tablet and slid it toward him. It was a profile of the hospital's external legal counsel, Mr. Gregory Thorne, the same shark who had represented Marcus, the man who had argued in court that my paralysis was a burden on his client, the man who had tried to leave me destitute. "Mr. Thorne sits on your legal advisory board," I stated. "He also handles your malpractice litigation. I find his ethics to be incompatible with the mission of this hospital. If you want this check, Mr. Thorne needs to be terminated from all contracts with St. Jude's immediately. Effective today." Dr. Sterling looked at the check. Then he looked at the tablet. It wasn't a hard choice. Thorne was just a lawyer. $5 million was a future. "Consider it done," Ms. Vance Sterling said, nodding vigorously. "We will notify his firm within the hour." I lifted my hand and let him take the check. I watched them leave, bowing and scraping as they backed out of the office. I spun my chair around to look out at the skyline again. I had taken Marcus's freedom. I had taken Becky's family. And now I had taken his lawyer's career. I took a sip of my sparkling water and watched the sun set over the city I now owned. It was a beautiful day to be alive. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper, soft hiss, revealing the penthouse that had once been my prison. It looked different now. I had stripped away the cold marble statues and the sterile leather furniture that Marcus favored. The space was now warm, filled with velvet and modern art, and the scent of fresh white lilies. It was no longer a stage for his ego. It was a home for my victory. I walked across the plush rug, my heels sinking slightly into the fabric. The silence was absolute. There were no insults being thrown, no heavy sighs of resentment, no whispers of conspiracy, just the low hum of the city below and the steady beat of my own calm heart. I walked to the wet bar, the same spot where I had watched Marcus open my vintage Cabernet on the surveillance feed just a few months ago. He had spilled it on the counter that night, carelessly wasting something precious because he didn't understand its value. I reached into the temperature-controlled wine fridge and pulled out a pristine bottle of 1992 Screaming Eagle. I had bought it at auction this morning to replace the one he stole. It cost $6,000, but to me it cost nothing. It was pocket change. I uncorked the bottle with a smooth, practiced motion. The rich aroma filled the air, redolent of dark fruit and oak. I poured a single glass, watching the ruby liquid settle. I didn't rush. I let it breathe. I picked up the crystal stemware and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering expanse of Chicago. From here, I could see everything. Somewhere out there in the dark, Becky was stocking shelves. Somewhere else, Mama Louise was sleeping in a narrow hospital bed. And far away in a concrete cell, Marcus was staring at a blank wall. I caught my reflection in the glass. I didn't see the broken woman in the wheelchair anymore. I saw a titan. I saw the person who had survived the crash, the paralysis, the betrayal, and the poverty. They had tried to bury me, but they forgot that I was a seed. They thought that by stripping me of my resources, they would leave me helpless. They didn't realize that my true resource was never the money. It was my mind. I raised the glass to my reflection, a toast to the woman I had become. I took a slow, deliberate sip, tasting the complex notes of the wine. It tasted like justice. You know, Marcus used to say that I was too soft. He said I let people walk all over me. He mistook my patience for weakness. He mistook my silence for compliance. He never understood the fundamental nature of the woman he married. I looked directly into the reflection of my own eyes, imagining Marcus could see me one last time. There is an old saying that my grandmother used to tell me. She said that a woman is like a tea bag. You can look at her and think she is fragile. You can think she is small, but you never know how strong she really is until you put her in hot water. I smiled, a cold, sharp smile that signaled the end of the game. And Marcus, you made a fatal mistake. You didn't just put me in hot water. You boiled it. You turned up the heat until there was nothing left but the essence of who I am. And that essence was strong enough to drown you. I finished the wine and set the glass down on the windowsill. I turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, leaving only the city lights to illuminate my silhouette. The story was over. The villain was gone, and the queen had reclaimed her castle. Fade to black. True strength is not defined by physical capacity, but by mental resilience. Jasmine's journey teaches us that even when life strips you of your assets, your health, and your support system, you still possess the ultimate weapon, your mind. Marcus failed because he mistook silence for weakness and patience for submission. He underestimated the power of a woman pushed to the edge. Remember, rock bottom is not a burial ground. It is a solid foundation upon which to build an empire. Do not let your current circumstances dictate your future worth. If this story of cold calculation and ultimate justice satisfied your craving for revenge, subscribe now for more.